Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, good.
That's good. Here's Catherine.
Oh, yeah, she's coming in.
So
Oh, yeah, I can
we've
see it.
got a lot of registrants, eh?
Yeah,
Hi,
150.
Catherine.
How you doing?
Good, thank you. So is having too many okay?
Yeah, nobody has been blocked or kind of put in a standby list. Everybody's allowed, so at least,
Okay.
yeah.
Generally, the people, the number who registered don't show up, so
Yeah,
probably be
Absolutely.
okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
true. Yeah,
that's
And if
true.
not,
Yeah.
then we get to say, wow, we're
it's great. Yeah,
completely filled. So welcome to the people on YouTube.
yeah, it's true.
Rodrigo, are you able to see the names? I went into the account today and I could not get the names and emails like I did the last time.
Oh yeah, look, I'll share it for a second the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think I can show you here. Yeah, that's because I launched it already. Probably I can't. Yeah, no.
Have you got spring down there, Catherine?
Oh yeah, we've had beautiful couple of days. Just
Yeah.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
Just gorgeous. You guys too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Have any
Yeah.
snow left?
Yeah, there's still snow, but
It's slow,
he's
but
going fast.
yeah, he's going very fast.
Got the door open and boy,
Yeah,
it was almost shorts weather today.
Yeah, it went up to 15 here or something.
Is that
Crazy
right,
about
eh?
that.
Oh,
Crazy.
Mhm.
That better? Is that better? Is it low light better? Maybe low light's better. I don't know. I'm yellow.
you're not yellow.
You're yellow.
It's that color. I'm not using my light, my window light. Anyway, yeah. So I'm gonna say hello. This is being recorded. Welcome to all those who joined us here in the webinar and those who are joining us via YouTube. Welcome to Eastern Canada and our second webinar in the series on the impacts of glyphosate and intensive forest management in New Brunswick. This issue has become one of the most talked about environmental issues here in the Maritimes, as well as around the world. Our goal is to bring information, research, and perspective to this issue. But first, we want to find out, who do we have in our audience? I'm going to bring up that poll, that
Now
very
it's
first
only
poll.
Margot and a guy called Rodrigo.
So far.
Oh, George said, Rodrigo, if you want to invite him, he'll keep his eye on things.
Yeah, I send an invite to him.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah. As soon as he sent it to me, like.
Okay, he's up to his ears and stuff, but he'll keep his ears
Oh,
open
yeah.
for my screens, if there are any screens.
Just in case.
I bet business is good, eh? For this kind of facilitation.
Yeah, it's increasing all the time.
Just
So
Amazing.
yeah. Well, I mean, George was already doing it before all this stuff happened. He was doing more of a hybrid, so he would send camera people and he would go and he would switch, live AGMs and stuff with a component of online. But then, of course, everything went to hell in a handbasket, and then nobody could do anything live. So
yeah.
So he picked up. It's just this little tiny period that's really super busy because it's AGM time and fiscal year.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder what's going to happen when people, my husband went back to his office today for the very first time in a year.
Oh,
So I wonder what's going to happen when people start going. I predict that people will still use Zoom
Oh, yeah. I think there'll be hybrid jobs everywhere, right?
Mhm.
Where there might be some jobs that you have to go in for a couple days a week or something, or a month.
Yeah, yeah,
But I mean, employers will save a fortune too, right? They don't have to
absolutely. Yeah.
provide the building.
Well, the building and the travel and the accommodation and,
Yeah.
what's it going to mean for, conferences and, retreats and all this? It's just, you really wonder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure makes it easier, that's for sure. I mean, all things being the same, there's a lot of technical background work that has to be done, but I mean, compared to booking rooms and getting people to say whether they want a single room or a double room or when they're going to arrive and all that stuff, I think it's
Oh, yeah.
quite simple.
Well, and think of the amount of time you spend traveling to a
Oh,
conference.
yeah. Yeah. But it'll just speed things up that much more.
Well, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my God.
I think
all these-
people will still want, once a year meeting in person. Because you do get more out of meeting in person than you do
That's
on,
very true. Yeah.
no
you do,
question.
for
But it
sure.
sure does change how, like I'm teaching, right? I'm teaching one course and it's all
Mhm.
online now.
Mhm.
Really, you really have to change your approach big time. Like
Yeah.
big time.
Do you
So-
enjoy that?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I really like the students are, they're always interesting. They always have something to share and teach you. But I can't say I'm loving online.
Mm.
I would much rather, you can read body language, you can see all their faces in class.
Yeah.
Online.
They
you
got
can
their
see-
video off and they're off
Well,
doing
no.
something.
Nope, they all come with their video on,
Okay.
but when you share a screen, half of them
Yeah.
disappear, 3/4 of
Right.
them disappear, right? Or, you're showing a video, you don't know if they hate it, they're checking their phone, they're
Yeah.
whatever.
Baking banana bread.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what did your husband think about going back to the office?
He was okay with it. I think, he says he kind of misses the office, so whatever. I mean, I said I'll miss you when you go back to work because we've been both cooped up in the house for a year.
Mm,
But anyway, well, it's good. It's a good little break.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, it's nice to socialize a bit.
It is, and he's
Yeah.
only doing it for a short while too. He's going to come back home and anyway.
Is he retiring?
No, it's just it's a quarantine thing, and we're taking our son's apartment while he and his girlfriend stay in our house because they have no outside at the apartment, and we can come and go, but at our place they can be outside. So
Okay.
yeah, he decided to go back to the office, which is just a short walk away from their apartment. So downtown Fredericton.
So parental sacrifices.
I guess, yeah, it's not too much of a sacrifice, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So I don't know where our guys are.
Hmm.
Our main event here.
Mhm. Don't know how
I'll send them an email here. Just,
you can carry it, Margot.
oh, right.
That's right.
Yeah.
She should.
Rodrigo will run the slides. You just follow the
You
slides.
just read out of the slides.
Rodrigo, do you have all the slides? I hope.
Yes, I have both Rod's and Marc's, but we tried them yesterday, and Marc needed to change computers, so he's going to run
Okay.
out of another computer today.
Okay.
He felt that he could run them himself. If not, I have mine here, the same deck, so
Good.
I can run it for him.
Did you guys hear that Mexico,
Hmm?
What is it?
you guys hear that Mexico banned glyphosate?
Oh, yes.
No, really?
Wow, that's
Mexico.
huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. Because I'm from Argentina, you know, and it's, I don't know how much is used in the woods, but because it's such a huge producer of soy, they export most of the soy to China. The cases of malformations in babies and all kinds of horrible things. His stories come all the time on the press, but the lobby of the agro exporters is so huge.
Yeah.
And Monsanto, yeah, can pretty much do whatever they want but it has been a fight for forever. Like,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
it is used extensively all
Well,
over the place.
I mean, I think it's good that Mexico banned it because it's been off and on with them for a while, but,
Yeah.
you know, it's always subject to being overturned, right? When the new government gets in or whatever.
Of course.
So,
Especially if the GATT comes in and
GATT, yeah.
if they tell them that is not, you know, that is not fair, and they can end up paying all kinds of, I don't know. But it's good that at least they are trying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Brazil, Argentina, they don't do anything. Like, would be nice if they follow the example.
Is Argentina like a right-wing government as well right now?
Well, no, they have changed right now, like just lately, but so that's one of the things that is on the agenda, but we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah. Brazil's having quite a time of COVID from the sounds of it. Lots of infections.
Yeah, it's not as bad as in Brazil.
Brazil is, that's what it is.
Terrible.
Terrible. Just awful.
Terrible. Well, it's that cycle of Bolsonaro that is pretty much
like
kind
Trump.
of following the book. Yeah, the Trump manual.
Yeah.
So no, it's horrible.
Yeah. Well, it's not good.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, guess that wasn't clear.
Oh my goodness.
I watched the documentary that Radio Canada did on him. He sent me a link to it on Marc André.
Yeah.
That was very interesting.
Yeah, Irving kind of drummed him out of town and cut his funding, and you know.
He said cut his funding and cut the scholarships to the students, right?
The students at UMB,
Yeah.
He's had a hard time. These people that are willing to stand up for principle really pay a price, and really have to hand it to them for doing it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to resort to text now.
You know, we can call them.
Rodrigo, it says we have 5 participants, 2 attendees, so 2 people have joined us.
Yeah.
George and Mary.
But it's funny because I put George as a panelist, so I don't know why
Oh, no, we must have 2 attendees, but that's not the, he didn't end up in,
The other one is Mary Bartlett.
I just wonder if, it says that attendees 1, I just wonder if they're suffering the same thing as we did last night. There's Marc André.
Yeah, it's coming in now. But yeah, well, maybe people are waiting to just get in at 7.
Okay. Yeah. Bye. No,
1212.
Yeah. Salut Marc-André.
Bonjour.
There you are.
I have a few adjustments to make.
There you have.
Hello, Marc-André.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
That's good. Fine, thank you.
Here comes Rod. We have a couple people who are attending already,
Yeah.
just joining us.
Sorry, didn't mean to give you a heart attack.
Okay,
It's okay.
we figured Margot could carry it.
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
All right.
Hi, George. How you been?
There's George. Hi, George.
Hi there. Busy,
quite the
busy,
background.
crazy busy.
Yeah, they've got that
Blur.
blur thing happening. Yep.
Okay. So that's your actual background. It's just blurred out by the, okay.
Yeah.
It's the software that takes it out.
There you go. Well, I hope we have one cat filter on this meeting tonight, just to break
Cat
the,
filter, yeah. So we
there's
have,
the difference.
we have 2 attendees here now. Just to let the attendees know that you cannot be seen, you cannot be heard except via the
Q&A.
button at the bottom of your screen, which is going to be Q&A. You should have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And that will give you a chance to ask questions or to put in your questions that will be answered at the end of the talks by Marc-André Villard and Rod Cumberland. Let's hope my lips work because that's important tonight. So this is the informal chat before we get to the real show, which starts at 7 o'clock. And so Rodrigo, I'm going to say goodbye to you, and Margot, I'm going to say
Bye-bye.
goodbye to you. And George, we're going to say
Sounds
goodbye to
good.
you. Thank you very much.
See you guys. Thanks
You
for
know
your
you
help.
have our backs. Okay, and
Just one last thing. Marc-André, you're okay with your deck of slides, or do you
Yeah.
want me to play it?
Nope,
for you?
I can use mine.
Okay, excellent. That's it. That was my only question.
okay,
But thanks for asking.
all right. So as people slowly arrive here before the show, why don't we just have a little chat about what has made you gentlemen so passionate about this topic? We'll start with Marc-André, just because you're closest to me on my screen.
I guess it's a result of camping with my parents since I was about 4 or 5 years old, spending summers being bitten and enjoying the outdoors. And my uncles were harvesting wood in the Quebec townships. So that's how I got into forestry as well. I've never worked in forestry, but I was, sensitive to this activity, and I was really keen to get to know more and more animals, especially, and then eventually plants.
Which gets back to the biting part that you said you were being bitten a lot.
Well, the good thing is
Bugs, I guess.
we were bitten so much that eventually we now I don't react to any bug whatsoever,
Well, that's
except
good.
except bees and wasps, of course.
Yes. The larger, nastier creatures.
Yep.
But they're all God's creatures, right, Rod? Okay, Rod, so how did you become passionate?
I was born passionate. So it was
Not
just a
going
matter,
there.
it was just a matter of whatever I did, it was going to be, I mean, anybody that knows me knows that I'm a passionate guy, and I go 150 mile an hour. So, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I was actually working for Kent Building Supplies, believe it or not, for JD Irving, when I decided, I don't think I want to do this the rest of my life. And I actually met with the three big guys, Jim and Arthur and them. They took me out for a big seafood dinner, and and it's quite a story actually, but they were promising me the moon, but they couldn't actually pay me what they owed me for the last 2 months. And I kept telling them, are you going to pay me? No, we're going to do this. And anyways, I finally said, guys, see you around. I'm going to college. So I packed my bags and went to UNB. Somebody told me that, a good friend of mine, their mother said, you know, what would you love to do the rest of your life? And you should go do it. And I said, man, I would love to work with white-tailed deer for a living. And when I was 32 years old, I had my dream job. I was a provincial deer biologist and, you know, managing deer herd 100 mile an hour. And, you know, I really enjoyed that job. Actually, I miss that job terribly, in all honesty. Crunching numbers and growing the herd and seeing how everything impacts deer herd growth. But what made me passionate about this was when we're talking about Crown land and how it's managed. And I had mentioned that, you know what, as a professional and a practitioner, seeing it on the ground, what I thought was occurring, and people didn't want to hear it. And instead they actually used incorrect science. And of course, that's really what sparked me up was, the misinformation and the control of information, and saying that basically, you know, people like us had no place, no business in speaking out about the issue on Crown land. And of course, that lit a fire under me that's still burning pretty bright. So
You said you started tracking white-tailed deer with your dad, though, right?
yeah, I think I was 5 years old the first time he took me hunting with him, and I heard the continual shh, shh, shh. But my father was an unbelievable hunter. Like he had this uncanny ability to outsmart a buck, and it's amazed me. Even I'm 56 years old, and it still amazes me how that guy shot the deer he did when he did. But actually, we'll talk about it tonight, because when he was hunting, there was a pile of deer. It was a lot easier to shoot a big buck back then than it is now.
It wasn't that hard. Oh, okay.
So yeah, and we'll talk about that. But yeah, he instilled the love, and he knew a lot. I actually, as far as deer behavior, I learned more from my dad, who has a grade 8 education, than I did from any PhD. So I mean, he was a smart guy, and he observed. He knew what was going on around him.
You don't need a PhD to be smart.
Yeah, right on, buddy. Although you have both.
Ah, mutual admiration here. Anything you want to say about Rod?
So are you still?
Sorry, go
Sorry.
ahead.
Are
No,
you
go
still owed 2 months' pay?
Are you still owed 2 months' pay, Rod? Are you, Rod?
Well,
Are you still owed 2 months' pay?
2 months or too much?
2 months,
months.
pay from
From
that
the-
I know a
job.
little bit more than that.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, about 14 to be exact. But anyways, we can't talk about that.
No, we were talking about the job back with Kent.
Yeah.
when you
Oh
were
yeah,
at
I never got that.
Kent.
No.
Oh dear. Rodrigo, I'm guessing that you are going to make it the three of us at some point, just so we can. Oh, we're now streaming live on Facebook. Okay, that's great. I just want to welcome people who are joining us for this pre-show. We're 5 minutes from the top of the clock, and that's when we will start the official show. This is kind of just a chat with our two speakers, Marc André Villard and Rod Cumberland. And so welcome to the webinar. And because this is a webinar, just so you know, if you are in the audience, you will not be seen and you will not be heard, but you can watch and there will be participation and you will have the chance to ask questions. And all those questions that you have building up can go in the Q&A, please, because we will be watching the question and answer form. So it is a button at the bottom of your screen, should say Q&A. We're not going to be taking questions through chat. It's just too many things to monitor. Okay, so there is no chat available for the audience, but there is Q&A. So please, you don't have to wait till the speakers are finished to put your questions in. As they come up, you can put them in there, and then both gentlemen will deal with them at the end of their talks. Okay, so we should try a fun poll. Rodrigo, can we put up a fun poll to show participants that actually this is one of the ways we'll just be taking a litmus test on a couple of questions. Here you go. This is your question for March, of course. Maple syrup. What is it? Where do you like it the best? Pancakes, snow, your spoon, ice cream. Go ahead and answer one of those, and we'll see where the audience stands on this. So feel free to just select one of those things. Da-na-na-na. Can we do that Jeopardy hum? Come on, people. This is how we're going to be polling you. Oh, nobody cares for maple syrup. Are they having a hard time? Are they not seeing the poll? That's odd. Host and panel, we can't vote, so we can't fill this in. So what do you like maple syrup on the best, Rod?
Pancakes. I make man cakes. Ever since the kids were little, I made huge pancakes, and we called them man cakes, but it was a lot of fun.
Too funny. Okay, what about you, Marc-André?
I'd say pancakes as well.
Pancakes too. I have to say snow, because that was, as a kid, they'd take us out to the maple sugar farms, and you got to get out of school, go on a bus, have something sweet. That's just like 3 out of 3. I just want to ask, though, it seems this is odd that nobody's filling this out. So I'm wondering, Rodrigo, can you check that? If anybody cannot, if the people in the audience as an attendee, if you can't see the poll, can you put that in the Q&A so we can know that the polls are not working? Just want to see if someone.
I have someone in the Q&A that had put the answer in the Q&A and not in the poll. Maybe they are not seeing it.
Pancakes, no question. I filled in the poll. Polls are working, says Nadine Setzer, but we don't see them. Do you see someone filling out do you see numbers?
I'm seeing people answering in the Q&A and not in the poll.
But not in the poll.
Yeah.
The poll was visible, but not the results. Can you see the results? How
Yes, I can. I haven't in the poll because I'm waiting for the people to answer, but I see the results coming dynamically. So.
So there are people. You are seeing people click on it. Okay. Okay. Good. Thank you. Filled out the poll. Yeah, filled out the poll. Okay, so you are seeing a poll. That's good to know.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Just gonna say, so pancakes. Okay, it's 7 o'clock. So let's get those the results of that poll. We'll just have a look at that. Oh, pancakes, the winner. 26% snow, my personal favorite, and 16% just suck it back on the spoon, right off the spoon, which is also equally delightful. Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll get started on the more serious stuff. All right. So welcome to, there's a raised hand. Why do I see a raised hand? That's me. How did I raise my hand? Rodrigo, now you have your hand up. Okay. So it's 7 o'clock. Welcome. Good evening. I'm Catherine Harrop. I'll be your moderator for tonight. This video session, this webinar is being recorded. So I want everybody to know that. Welcome to those who have joined us here in the room. We have 29 attendees so far. We have 115 people who signed up for this, so I expect more people will be coming in as we get underway. Welcome to those who may be joining us via YouTube as well. Also, welcome to Eastern Canada and our second webinar in the series on the impacts of glyphosate and intensive forest management. The issue has become one of the most talked about environmental issues in the province, in the Maritimes, and of course around the world. Our goal is to bring information, research, and perspective to this issue. So we want to begin with another poll. So we're going to bring up a poll to see who is attending tonight. We want to know a little bit about you. So Rodrigo, who is our exceptional technical help on this, is going to bring up a poll, and it says, have you, oh, we got a different one. Okay, well, we'll try that one. Have you personally witnessed any changes to the wildlife and habitat around where you live as a result of spraying, or if you think it's a result of spraying? Answer yes or no. Of course, we know that causality, being able to prove something was directly related to the spraying, is difficult scientifically and is expensive, but we'll hear more about that in the coming presentations. So 70%, 16 people have said that yes, they've witnessed changes to their wildlife and habitat after spraying has occurred, and 30% say no. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, I'm going to go right on then to introduce you to the two gentlemen you see on your screen who will be speaking tonight. We have Rod Cumberland and Marc-André Villard. Both are very knowledgeable in the areas of wildlife habitat management and how intensive forest management has changed those habitats. I just want to remind people who are coming in now, we have 35 attendees, that we will be taking questions and answers. No, we'll be taking questions. We'll guess that Rod and Marc-André will be giving the answers. We ask you to put those questions in the Q&A. So use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can do that as they speak, as the questions occur to you, and we will be coming to them at the end of the talk. So glyphosate, as many of you know, is a herbicide used to reduce and destroy primarily leafy vegetation under power lines, to clear the military training areas such as Base Gagetown, and to kill hardwood competition on plantations on Crown land after clear cutting. Now, according to the 2016 provincial government report, New Brunswick is second only to Ontario in the amount of forest land treated with glyphosate in 2016. The spraying causes more controversy every year. This year, 2021, marks the 20th anniversary of Quebec banning the use of glyphosate on forestry operations on public land. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Marc-André Villard. Armed with a doctorate in biology, Marc-André Villard is presently a consultant for CEPAC, which administers all national and provincial parks in Quebec. He has conducted research on the effects of intensive forest management on biodiversity indicators, mainly in northwestern New Brunswick and the Miramichi Highlands. Most of his work has focused on forest songbirds and woodpeckers as indicators of the effects of selection harvesting and plantation silviculture. He is also a published author. So Marc-André Villard, take it away.
Thank you, Catherine. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I will start my presentation and share the screen. Oops, host disabled participant screen sharing. That's not a good start.
I'll get you going soon. Wait a second. You're supposed to. No. Come on.
Still
Yeah.
not enabling me to share. So if it doesn't-
Catherine, you're still muted. Sorry, dear.
Should be under your screen, share screen.
Yeah, I'm
Uh,
trying and it's
no,
disabled.
Rodrigo has to
Yeah.
allow you to share.
There you go.
There you
It
go.
could be good now.
Yes,
Excellent. Here we go.
right. So the title of my talk is How to Tame a Wild Forest. I think you will understand why, because I think that's what we've done in New Brunswick. So I think the first important notion I wanted to convey here is that we pretend that we do sustainable forest management. That's kind of a mantra, that's an expression that is widely used, but to pretend that we do sustainable forest management, we should understand the disturbance history of the ecosystem. Because natural disturbance regimes have created the arena in which the species that we know today have evolved for millennia. And of course, it's pretty hard to study a virgin forest in New Brunswick, but we can fortunately go right across the border from Perth and Dover and find an area of about 20 square kilometers of virgin forest called the Big Reed Forest Reserve, which is managed by the Nature Conservancy. And this forest has been allowed to evolve naturally for a very long time. And I took out some stats to give you an idea of the structure of this forest. So the mean tree age is 107 years. The maximum tree age is 352 years. The density of very large trees, meaning trees 21 inches in dBH or more, that's in the States, so it's all in inches and acres. So that figure is 6.5 per acre. It probably doesn't tell you much, but it's about 6 times higher than the main average. And so is the density of large snags, which is about 6 times higher than the main average. So obviously, this forest has a very specific structure that tends to differ from what we find on average in the landscape of Maine, but also in New Brunswick. There's been some research work done in the Big Reed Forest Reserve to figure out how this forest evolved over time and what were the main natural disturbances responsible for this evolution. And the researchers who did this work, Sean Frover and his collaborators, found that on average, only about 1% of the forest canopy, so the top layer of trees, turned over per year as a result of tree senescence, so a tree dying out, or windrow primarily. And they found that the fires were very, very rare and not covering a large area when they occurred. Of course, prior to human intervention, there were large-scale disturbances from spruce budworm outbreaks. But an important notion is that the Acadian forest is a mixed wood forest. And therefore, one would expect that the budworm had less of a party when it started invading New Brunswick thousands of years ago, because the conifer stands, and especially balsam fir, was not as densely populated as it is now. As a matter of fact, Mosler et al. Have described the Acadian forest as being a forest where the dominant and codominant trees reach about 150 years of age. And it's dominated by shade-tolerant, long-lived species such as sugar maple, beech, eastern hemlock, and red spruce, with a significant component of balsam fir, eastern white pine, and yellow birch. So it's a very diverse forest. It's a forest that is mixed, and therefore it didn't feature large-scale stand replacing disturbances like we see in the landscape these days. All right, so all this to say that I'm not against forestry. My own uncles were harvesting wood and trucking wood around for a living. So, however, this has to be planned wisely, because if we're talking about the Crown lands, this is a public resource. It should be managed wisely for the better good of everyone. And there is a continuum of management regimes that can be perceived in this slide, which is called the triad concept. So you can have at one end land that's devoted to high production, called intensive management. At the other end of the scope, you can have strict protected areas. And in between, you can have areas under extensive management, which allow you to meet both conservation and timber values. All right, so what's the state of New Brunswick with respect to that kind of continuum? Well, as you know, New Brunswick is moving towards achieving a 10% protected area goal. The figures for plantations seem to vary between the people I speak to, but they range from about 20 to 25% of the land base by the end of the current forest management plan, which leaves about 65 to 70% of the land under under extensive management. So in other words, every hectare of forest is under some form of management on 90% of our land base. So can we maintain the ecological integrity of the Acadian forest under such intensive forest management? On the right side of the screen, you can see an aerial photograph of a piece of landscape, and on that photograph, you can see a variety of different harvest treatments, both in the hardwoods and in the softwoods. You can see plantations, you can see clear cuts, patch cuts in the hardwoods, and selection cuts. So my students and I worked for about 20 years in northern New Brunswick. And my hypotheses for the effects of intensive forest management would be that the species would be especially affected would be species associated with older forests, such as the American tree-toed woodpecker. Species associated with closed canopy deciduous forests or mixed wood forests, like the ovenbird. Species that are tightly linked to mixed wood forests, like the black Burnin warbler. Species associated with moist, shady conditions, like some epiphytic lichens that grow on trunks and branches. And finally, species that don't move very well across a clear cut, such as flying squirrels, or even some bird species, as we will see. oops, sorry, this is the this is the epiphytic lichen called Loberia pulmonaria. All right, so we had the following predictions. The first prediction was that New Brunswick's forest birds would be less tolerant to contemporary harvesting than boreal forest birds, because in New Brunswick, as we saw, the forest was extremely stable over time compared to the boreal forest, where there were extensive forest fires and insect outbreaks. The second prediction was that the species associated with older conifer stands would be less prevalent in spruce plantations, even in older spruce plantations of 40 to 50 years of age, which is roughly the age where harvesting takes place. The third prediction was that partial cutting would have negative effects on species that are dependent upon moist, shady conditions. And finally, the fourth prediction was that species associated with older deciduous stands would be reluctant to move across spruce plantations or clear cuts. So we'll walk you through this figure because it's quite complicated, but essentially colleagues and I compared the forest bird assemblage of New Brunswick to those assemblages of boreal forests in Alberta and Quebec. So there were two regions, two study areas in Quebec, one in Alberta, and our study area, New Brunswick, which is shown by the red circle. And as predicted, we expected that there would be more forest bird species associated with older forests that would be sensitive to forest management. And indeed, if you look at the frequency of occurrence of old forest associates, there are more in New Brunswick than in either of the boreal forest regions, indicating that in New Brunswick, we still have quite a few species that are associated with old forest, but those species are also sensitive to contemporary forest management, as we will see. So the second prediction was to compare the older spruce plantations we could find to naturally regenerated conifer forest, which is shown on the right side. And of course, those two forests are very different, but the fact of the matter is that the naturally regenerated conifer forests are quickly disappearing from the landscape, being replaced by plantations. So if we lose those natural conifer forests, will the birds be able to persist in the older plantations? And we were especially interested in cavity nesters, species that use tree cavities for nesting. And as one would expect, there was an increase both in cavity nester richness, so the number of species of cavity nesters like pileated woodpecker, for example, with the density of snags. But the green dots at the bottom show you that all the plantations had fewer cavity nesters than the naturally regenerated conifer forests, as we would expect. We also wondered if there would be more cavity nesters in plantations when there was more natural conifer forest surrounding them. So we looked at the effect of the amount of naturally regenerated conifer forest within 700 meters of a station in the plantations on the number of cavity nesters. And as you can see, there's a quick increase. So as you have more natural conifer forests, you have an increase in the number of cavity nesters, but this increase is not very obvious for plantations compared to natural forests. So we can't really compensate for plantations by having more conifer forests in the landscape. The third prediction was that as you open up the canopy of deciduous forests or mixed-wood forests, you affect certain species that depend on moisture and shady conditions. And the two species of lichens that we looked at were both less abundant and less fertile in partial cuts. So in areas where 30 to 40% of the basal area of trees was removed through harvesting. Again, this is Loberia pulmonaria. And the last prediction was to determine whether birds associated with deciduous forest or mixed wood forest would have a hard time moving around the landscape when the landscape is dominated by plantations. And we had to do a little bit of an experiment to address this question because it's pretty hard to track small birds across the landscape. And our focal species is the ovenbird. So on the left side, you can see a female incubating her eggs. And on the right side, you can see an adult carrying food. So this bird is associated with closed canopy, deciduous or mixed wood stands, mature stands. And it's very easy to capture in mist nets, as you can see in the central picture here that I'm showing with the arrow. So we can lure them in nets using playbacks of their songs. And the males are very aggressive, so they attack the speaker and they get caught in the net. And we move those birds over 5 to 6 kilometers in 2 different situations that are shown in the figure. So on the top, you see a landscape that is dominated by spruce plantations. And you can see the capture site in the black star and the release site in the shown by the red star. So we captured the birds on their territories early in the breeding season. We moved them 5 to 6 kilometers away. We released them. And the thing that a territorial bird will do usually is return to its territory because the bird has invested energy securing that territory. It knows its territory. And we use that property to figure out whether the probability that the bird would return to the capture site would be influenced by the proportion of plantations. So as I mentioned, the top landscape here is dominated by plantations, and the bottom landscape is dominated by various types of deciduous stands, which are more familiar to an ovenbird because that's where they nest. And we did this 2 years in a row, and we moved overall 48 birds. And as you can see, the birds that we moved in the deciduous landscape were about twice as likely or more to return to their territory during the time we monitored the territories. So even though those birds are long distance migrants that winter in Mexico and Central America, they seem to be reluctant to move across plantations. So the take-home messages are that New Brunswick forest species evolved in a relatively stable ecosystem compared, for example, to boreal forests. Intensive management, therefore, greatly exceeds the tolerance of many species of plants and animals to these activities. And finally, plantation silviculture affects both species richness and landscape connectivity, the ability of certain species to move across the landscape. So I will be happy to take questions later on after my friend Rod gives his presentation.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of the ovenbird before.
Yeah, the name comes from the nest that is shaped like a Dutch oven.
Huh.
Now I'm trying to unshare. Stop sharing. Okay, there we go.
There we go. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Villard. And now we're going to have Rod Cumberland speak. Again, you may put your questions in the Q&A. As we're waiting, we will come to those at the end of both presentations. So as some of you may know, Rod Cumberland is a certified wildlife biologist. He has been since 1995. His obsession with the province's deer herd began in university and continued in his 15-year-long post as New Brunswick's longest-serving deer biologist. As the province's deer biologist, he observed yet another decline in the deer population that he had observed with his father back in the 70s. And this was in the late 80s and early 90s. Rod has observed and counted deer and moose by helicopter every year, and he added a profuse amount of biological data from the ground. He also initiated a fawn mortality study, eventually publishing 6 peer-reviewed wildlife papers. He currently works as a researcher in Fredericton, and he joins us from his home in Keswick Ridge. Rod?
Thank you, Catherine. I'll bring my slides up. There. Everybody good? Okay, well, I consider it a privilege to be able to present at this webinar, and especially with my knowledgeable friend and colleague, Marc André. This will be one of the shortest presentations I've ever given on this topic. There's so much information to cover on a lot of different angles, but we're limiting our talks tonight so that it'll provide time for you people to ask questions at the end. If you want more information on this topic or the things that I've looked into, Health Canada review, a lot more detail on the deer, just go to YouTube and Google rod and glyphosate, and it'll pretty quickly come up with a few good documents, videos to watch. I want to start by saying that I've been very fortunate. I've been fortunate to work, teach, study, and recreate over the last 40 years plus with whitetail deer. I'm moving into my late 50s, and so I've been alive during most of the big changes that have occurred to the deer herd in the province. But more importantly, my interest has allowed me to notice these changes and to discuss, study, and look for solutions to what I've seen over my career. As a certified wildlife biologist working with DNR for most of my career, I had the opportunity to collect, analyze, and apply one of the best data sets for whitetail deer in all of North America, second only to Utah. My bent, I'm one that likes to dig deep. So my bent is towards searching, reading, and applying research. And from doing that, I understand that not everything published is actually applicable to the province, and I'll share some of that with you tonight. But any that do apply to the province, it should add to our understanding of what's going on. Finally, my passion has allowed me to engage in deer through almost every area of my life. My personal time, my family time, my work time, even our vacation time was spent at Northeast deer conferences. I've been from north to south of the province, born in Bathurst, hunted deer in Bathurst. Dad did in the 60s. Also seen it from both the land as a biologist and also from the air. I've had one of the most fortunate guys. I spent a lot of my time in the air in a chopper. From behind a bow, deep in the woods, and in the necropsy lab. All this opportunity has allowed me a very unique perspective on whitetail deer, and I hope I can share as much of this as possible to give you the view of the world from my perspective. So I just covered most of that information. And I just have to move us out of the way here a little bit. Okay. So before we can start talking about the decline in deer, I think I want to start with the increase in deer. And if you look across Eastern North America, the Northeast specifically, deer herds gradually increase, as you can see in the graph here. This is New Brunswick's deer harvest, and you can see this gradual decline over the early 1900s. And almost every jurisdiction here has that same kind of a trend. And if you read the papers, the historical papers on this, they'll all attribute the increase in deer numbers to habitat, to the improvement of habitat, and specifically browse that was available to deer in agricultural areas and also from clear-cut areas. Back in the 60s and 80s, when you see the two peaks here, deer occurred all across the province. And actually there was at one time even more deer in the north than in the south. Most people don't realize that now because the north has been closed for the most part since 1993. And also hunters hunted in the north. So, and they also hunted mostly on Crown land. And of course, that's what's changed. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. Now, there's lots of research that supports that contention that these areas, these cut areas that regenerate naturally, produce a profuse amount of deer food. Telfer in 72 analyzed that in New Brunswick out by the Acadia Experimental Station just outside of Fredericton and found that plantations produce between a ton to 10 tons of deer food, depending on what stage you're at in the first 10 years of their life cycle. And the reason that happens is because when you cut a hardwood tree in the wintertime, you have a stump and a fully formed root system. And the next spring, all this energy goes into stump sprouts, and it produces a lot of these sprouts. And usually they're single sprouts. You know, there may be 6, 8, 10, 20 on a stump, but they're just singles. And then the next year when they grow from the terminal bud and the lateral buds. So the deer, the first year will eat one, there's one shoot to eat from. And of course, the following year, now the lateral buds have grown. Now there's 3 places. And the following year, of course, the terminal buds and the lateral buds on all of those grow. And then you have 9 places a deer can feed on. So I say that because it produces an exponential amount of deer food, which is what's needed to support exponential growth in a deer herd. You don't get that in clover fields. You don't get that in apple orchards. You don't get that anywhere else but in cuts. And of course, that's what supported the exponential deer herd growth that we witnessed in the 60s and the 80s. I summarized in 2009, there's a technical report produced at Natural Resources, and I summarized all the research that was done at that time to show that cut areas produce a profuse amount of hardwood browse. It's very, very nutritional and has a lot of energy in it. So there's all kinds of research on that. Now, what happened in the late 1980s, we had a distinct and dramatic decline in the deer population. It happened over 4 years when we had 3 severe winters. 3 of the 4 winters were very severe. And of course, we had the peak in our coyote population that actually took advantage of those severe winters. Since then, since 1990, and that's at the bottom of the first steep decline, the herd basically maintained itself as we implemented an antlerless permit system. But you'll see 1997, that's when I took the reins. Nothing to brag about because, of course, you see the deer herd started declining then. We had the severe ice storm in 97, that dropped the herd, and then it went down the next 2 years. And being the deer biologist, I said, okay, guys, let's try all we can to grow this deer herd as fast as we can and as high as we can. So the next drop you see in 2001, that was a result of our management actions. I dropped the doe tags from about 12,000 to around 2,500, and it declined the first time in almost 30 years that we've seen a drop in the percent does in the harvest. So we knew it was working because it was saving does on the ground. And of course, you see for the next 7 years, the deer herd grew. That's the best herd growth we've seen in the last 30 years. But what happened was there was very little growth on Crown land. And we know that because we were surveying every winter at that time. It was also confirmed by our staff that were doing deer yard surveys to find out which yards were vacant and which yards were occupied, because of course the forest industry wanted those areas. And all that data showed very clearly that yes, deer herd had declined on Crown land. And even though despite the growth we saw, it wasn't occurring on Crown land. Now in 2008-9 is when I started the nuisance deer permit system, developed that for the province, because where the deer were growing was in areas we probably didn't want them growing, in agricultural areas and in urban and suburban areas. And it was very clear from the data, it was very clear from the phone calls, it was very clear from what we were seeing from the air. So there was a change in where deer were living. Now, as I said before, short-term changes that are a result of weather, you'll see that same kind of change in the harvests in your neighboring jurisdictions. And when our deer herd declined dramatically in the late 80s, we saw the same change occur in Maine, in Nova Scotia, and in Quebec. But since then, the long-term change, you know that as I showed you in the graph, there's a slow decline, slow steady decline in deer numbers in New Brunswick, to the point that if we compare the deer harvest in 2015 to where it was at in 1985, 30 years before that, you can see we lost 85%. Our deer herd's down 85%. Now, if we look at Maine, which is right next door to us, they have coyotes, they have similar winters. that they're harvesting the same number of deer they did 30 years ago, and the province of Quebec is up 300%. We all have severe winters. We all have coyotes. So something else is happening to cause such a disparity in the change in deer numbers. And again, if you look at the biggest change to the habitat that I can see is the spraying of glyphosate, intensive forest management. Maine uses a fraction of what we do. Quebec has had it banned since 2001. And of course, we can't show cause effect, but it's very curious. There's a strong relationship here showing that, where there's more glyphosate used, there's a lot less deer. But there's no one doing specific research on that topic. So let's look a little bit more at the data. So if we look at the habitat changes, again, I tried to put this, when I started mentioning this, that we were losing a lot of deer habitat, it was hard to convince people around me that that was what was occurring, because our assumption was there's all kinds of deer food. Everybody kept saying, well, we're cutting so much, there's lots of deer browse out there. So I put it in the terms that we could relate to from a deer's perspective. We spray between 13 and 15,000 hectares of ground every year. That's around 32 to 38,000 acres. And if you take the weight of the deer food that's produced on those cuts, it equals, on average, 150,000 tons of deer food. Now, that's hard for people to get their minds around how much food that is. But if we filled a dump truck full of deer food and we kept filling it up till 150,000 tons were filled, you would have enough dump trucks. That would be over 20,000 dump trucks. And if you put them bumper to bumper, they would extend from Miramichi City to Moncton in 1 year. Now, I would submit to you, rather than saying that's only 1% that we spray, if you put it in those terms, that is a lot. That's a pile of deer food. It's enough to feed 150,000 deer for that year, which is almost double the deer herd we have currently. And over the last 30 years, that's 5 million tons of deer browse. And to suggest removing that much food from the crown land base has no effect on deer is illogical. Other supporting research and evidence. Mouts in 76, he did a lot of work in New Hampshire and found that deer, even though maples may not be as abundant and may not be as energetically beneficial to deer, deer still selected for maples. And people always wonder, why is that? Morrison found the same thing when he did research up in the Plaster Rock area. The reason for that, as Mouts showed, is that the deer actually generate a lot of heat digesting maple browse. So when you get temperatures around -20, -30, having a way to generate body heat is probably a pretty useful thing. And of course, deer show that year in, year out. Now, the one study that's never mentioned is one done by Lise Caron in 96, right after the northern deer zones closed, and there was a lot of outcry about what's going on with the deer herd. And she found, when she looked at the data, that the only thing that correlated to the deer decline was the timber harvest around deer yards, not coyotes, not winter severity, and not hunter harvest. And further, she did a logistical regression and showed that only herbicide spray frequency affected the presence of deer in deer yards. And yet nobody talks about that study. I find that very peculiar. There's lots of other studies. I won't get into all of them because there's a lot there, but basically there was a huge, for years we had focused on cover in New Brunswick. And all of a sudden people started saying, listen, food's more important, or every bit as important, if not more important. And of course, the deer showed us that, because all of a sudden deer started leaving deer yards and started showing up in and around people's houses where there was very little cover, but all kinds of food. And Peter Peekins from the University of New Hampshire said, I remember when we first talked about this, he said, from my perspective, he was a deer energetics guy. He said, from my perspective, you could overwinter a deer in a parking lot as long as they have sufficient food. And I think he was right. If we look at the aerial survey data, so this is actual data on the ground that corroborates what I was seeing when we were flying every winter. There was no deer in plantations. Our surveyors would actually sit back and not look out the window. And I kept telling them, guys, we got to survey and make sure there's deer on the ground. But they said, we've done this so many years, we know there's no deer in these plantations. We just didn't see deer there. There was a lot fewer deer on crown land than there was on private ground. We saw most of our sightings on private ground. And every time we flew and I'd see a plantation or a regenerating clear cut, they look very different from the air. Naturally regenerating cuts look almost pink in the distance because of all the maple browse in them. And every time we flew over them, I'd say, who owns that ground? And I check in my map book, and 9 times out of 10 plantations were on crown ground, and 9 times out of 10 the regenerating stands were on private ground. As far as our data goes, from 2009 to 2012, my last 3 years at DNR, I looked at as much DNR data as we could. Plantations grow 90 to 95% soffit trees. And this theory or this thought that people throw that hardwoods bounce back is a misnomer. It totally defies tree silvics. And it also defies what the whole goal is of planting a plantation. The goal is to keep your AAC high so they can keep harvesting a large amount of timber. And if the plantations were at 90 to 95% stocked and void of hardwoods that compete with them, we would not get the growth and yield on those plantations to keep the AAC as high as they want it. So when people say that they're not monocultures and that they're not fully stocked, again, it defies logic and it defies all the other things that we look at in forestry. Two specific areas I looked at the time was a vacant deer yard around Bathurst and another area that the hunters told me about around the Macadavie River. And I looked at both of those areas, and in certain spots of the province, we are managing so intensely that of all the regenerating stands around the deer yard and in this area along the river, 70% of the regenerating areas were plantations. So there was very little deer food in those areas, which explained why the deer yard was vacant and why the hunters were seeing no deer in and around the Macadavie River. The other thing I did was get herbicide spray data from all the different woodlot owners in the province, the marketing boards, and also from Crown Land. And we were using, I can't remember now the exact numbers, but 10 to 12 times as much herbicide on Crown Land as we were on private land. So again, it all made sense. The last thing, now again, because I've been speaking out on this, there's been a study, and I'm glad there's a deer study. It's being done by UNB and University of Maine. They're spending a lot of time and money collaring a lot of deer around the province. And I went to one of their meetings at UNB, and the discussion there was, we can't find deer in New Brunswick that aren't fed to collar. We want a few deer collared that aren't fed at a feeder. And then the only place they could find one, the guys in Maine said, we have a spot in Maine. And he said, up in north, they're wild deer, and they've gone to a harvest operation. And I stopped them. I said, guys, you're answering your own question right now. The deer in New Brunswick are all being fed, which tells me that food is pretty important to deer in the winter. And the only place in Maine you can find them is around a cut area where there's a lot of browse available. And again, the data shows so clearly. Now, I'm not sure I will that in time, but I know I got to pick it up here a little bit. In my humble opinion, there's been a very conscious effort to discredit professionals that speak out about this topic. And they either discredit them, or if you can't discredit them and they still hang around, then you try to remove them from the picture, which I think is very unfortunate because we don't get a full picture of what's actually going on out there in the ground. One example I'll give you clearly, you can read all these points here, but basically the chief medical health officer, and we don't know why she was fired because she was given a settlement and we never found out, but she was studying glyphosate at the time that she was fired. And then of course, when she settled, there was a muzzle odor on her, so she can't speak to that. But shortly afterwards, when the public demanded that report that she was working on, it came out, or a report came out from the chief medical health officer. And basically, as soon as that came out, people said, oh, the Department of Health says glyphosate's safe to use. And I took great offense to that because that is not what that report was about. If you look at the facts, that what she looked at was what other jurisdictions around us were doing, and also looked at the patterns of use of glyphosate in the province, which showed that basically, as Catherine said at the start of the video series here, even though we're one of the smallest provinces in Canada, we are the second largest user of glyphosate. So we're using a pile of it on our landscape. I want to move along because the other place, if you Google glyphosate and deer in New Brunswick, typically the first hit you'll have is the Forest Info website. And again, I've asked for years and years to debate this in an open forum. I would love to talk about this issue in an open forum with whoever they want to bring along and talk about all the science and the issue, because I think we'll come to a couple of different conclusions. Here's another place where there's been a lot of misinformation based on science. And again, this is where I really take exception because science shouldn't be misaligned. But there's a lot of things we could talk about, but if I take it specifically to where they say that important winter foods of deer are cedar and balsam fir, and then they cite 5 papers. If you take each of those 5 papers, print them off from the website and actually read them, actually not on their website, but find them online, they don't say that cedar and balsam fir are preferred foods of deer in the wintertime. Morrison says there's 19 species of food that deer ate, and most consistently, maples were what they were selecting. He also showed that softwood stands had only 60% of them had less than 10% browse. None of them talked about fir. The only people that talked about fir, deer consuming fir, because it's not a preferred food at all in the wintertime. It's a starvation food that usually is eaten on Campbell or Graminon Island and Anacostia Island. The only study was Gray and Cervello that artificially fed deer And Teffer found that moose ate fur. Who was it here? Fur. Fur. It was artificially fed in Mouse's 1976 study. So they fed him. The only reason deer ate it, that's the only study they ate it in, and it was done because they artificially fed it. So again, when you get down to the nitty gritty of the science, you realize that what people are using it for, it may not apply. Here's another example, because what really concerned me when I first started looking at this is people said herbicides don't affect deer. And I thought, how can you say that? Makes no logical sense or ecological sense, because deer rely on browse in the Northeast. But when you generalize and say herbicides, that includes all herbicides used, and not all herbicides are created equal, because we know glyphosate is used primarily in New Brunswick because it's the best product for killing hardwoods, and it kills it very well. And if it doesn't kill your hardwoods really well in New Brunswick, we'll spray that place a second time, so to make sure our plantations are 90 to 95% stocked with softwoods, so we can keep our AACs high, and so they can be funded for their silviculture work, because unless they reach those goals, they won't get paid. So when I started looking at this, I realized, okay, all the studies that say that herbicide is good for deer is because they're generalizing. And if you look at the 20 studies that they generalized over, and I got a list of them here, and you can see it on my 2009 paper, most of them either combine herbicides. The ones that specifically use glyphosate, it may not even be white-tailed deer. Some of them were black-tailed deer in British Columbia, which is a totally different environment, or roe deer in France, which is entirely different than New Brunswick. But yet it was all used to say herbicides don't affect deer. If we tease it out and we look at white-tailed deer in the Acadia forest, there's only 2 papers that might qualify. One of them is Newton, done in Maine. And he actually is one of the guys that used a suite of herbicides, 2,4-D, 2,5,4, tricloper, and they're all weak herbicides, and they're not used any longer because hardwoods would bounce back. So that's why a lot of our biologists said for years, oh, hardwoods bounce back in cuts. Well, no, they don't, because we use glyphosate. And they always refer to that study because, again, there was a multiple of herbicides used. The only one that looked at white-tailed deer and glyphosate, deer browse, was Vreeland from Maine, Vreeland et al. And unfortunately, he didn't look at deer use. He just looked at whether it was present or not. If you look at that study, you'll see there's lots of other reasons why we can't apply that to New Brunswick. He didn't look at deer use specifically. They sprayed their cuts 15 years after they were cut. In New Brunswick, we spray this the year after they're cut right now. They were already dominated by softwood. And again, our cuts are dominated by hardwoods before we spray them. And of course, he didn't use the 2 main products, glyphosate products that we use here, which is Forza and Vision. So if you look at the details of science, you'll realize, okay, they're applying this research and saying this guy's found this out. But when you look at the study area and the methods, it really gives you a lot better picture of whether you can apply that result to our province or not. In fact, there's only one study that ever really addresses the issue, and it was Lise Caron, and she said that it does affect where deer live. So if I could just wrap up, the data is clear. The deer herds grew as a result of habitat change, and any long-term increase or long-term decrease, ecological concepts tell you it is habitat related, especially for herbivore. And especially herbivores that require between 5 and 50 pounds of food a day, which moose do 50 pounds and deer require 5. The data is also clear that the surrounding jurisdictions that we have around us that experience the same amount of coyote predation and the same type of winters have had totally different trajectories in their deer herds. And the only real difference we can see on the surface is that herbicide use is dramatically different in the 3 of them. We remove about 150,000 tons of deer food a year, which would feed 150,000 deer. And it's illogical to think that that won't impact deer. The people with an invested interest in using glyphosate actually defy that and actually use other science to say that no, that's not true. It doesn't make scientific sense. And also the data doesn't back it up. Our DNR data, all the applicable research that was done, our deer harvest and deer herd growth information that I looked at for 15 years, and everything I've observed goes in the face of that. So basically it's this long-term change in habitat, I believe, that's affected deer on Crown land and where they're living currently. And you really need to do your homework to make sure you're not getting duped by misinformation. If you want more information on this, I would encourage you to check out YouTube. I've given a lot more longer talks that cover it in a lot more detail. Anyways, that's what I have for tonight. So thank you very much for putting up with me, and I'll send it back to Catherine.
Thanks, Rod. That was great. Very interesting. So while we wait for you to enter your questions in the Q&A button, using the Q&A button, we're going to bring up another poll here. Rodrigo, if you can bring up the poll about our neighbors. If you have that, we'll have a look at that. There we go. How many of your friends and neighbors know about glyphosate? If you take a minute, we'll just give you a minute to look at that. Your choices are a few, some, most, all. And let us share the results as soon as you have them, Rodrigo. I'm guessing all your neighbors, Rod, know about glyphosate.
The ones that talk to me, you bet. No, I love my neighbors. We have a lot of good friends around here. And yeah, I think that's one of the issues, though. I don't think there is a lot of, most people think this is an issue for hunters and
Okay.
interesting. Yeah. They think it's an issue for hunters and people that are in the forest. And I don't think they realize, I mean, we're talking specifically about forest, but glyphosate is used in other areas. And I think it's becoming a more well-known and a bigger issue all the time. But this issue actually is an issue for anyone that pays taxes in the province, as far as I'm concerned, because we actually spray glyphosate with 3 million taxpayers' dollars a year. So, and we spray it on Crown forest, public forest.
Right. Okay, well, we'll go to the questions now. And we have one from David Crane, which you may have answered. But he says, where can I access the results of studies of spraying on white-tailed deer? On
Yeah,
what
and
you witnessed. You said YouTube Rod Cumberland, is that?
Yeah, there's
in particular.
what I would say, if they want copies, obviously they need to go to a library, but I've summarized almost all of those. You can find them in any of Lautenschlager's publications. He summarized a lot of the research, which is what I summarized as well in
Can
2000.
you spell that? Can you spell that for us?
Lautenschlager, Lautenschlager. Anyhow, but a closer one, or quicker, if you Facebook me or send me a message, I can send you the 2009 technical report I did at the Department of Natural Resources, and it has most of those citations in it.
Okay, thank you. David Crane, sorry, that was David Crane. An anonymous attendee said, I saw a point on your slide saying no one has studied the other 75% of the province. Why haven't you done any research on the other 75% of the forested land that is not planted or sprayed? Is there a possibility there is enough food out there to allow a population increase?
Yeah,
That's
the question. The question is, because we always hear the other 75%, and again, if you look at area, it's closer to 60%. And then you also need to ask yourself, where do they plant? One thing that I always try to make a point of is we plant the richest and best sites on Crown land, the ones that would produce the most amount of browse. So they don't plant wet areas, they don't plant rock areas, they don't plant steep slopes, they don't plant mountaintops. There's a lot of those places that they don't plant, and they don't plant them for a reason, because they won't get the growth they need to keep their annual allowable cuts high. And I've said all along, like, you need to go out and study those areas and see what's there. Is it willow? Is it pin cherry? Is it stuff that deer won't eat? What's growing there? You need to quantify it. And I've said that from the get-go, like, you can't say there's lots of food out there until you quantify it. And again, it has to be exponentially available. So, and I encourage people all the time, you need to look at that. That's what we don't know.
But I'll come back to the question, why haven't you done any research?
Myself?
Well, it says you, so I'm guessing maybe they think you're still doing some research, or Marc-André Villard.
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as I go, I'm not employed with the department any longer. I worked as a teacher the last 7 years, and I still did research on deer. I just didn't quantify that. And it would be easy to quantify. The other thing I would say even more that we should quantify is, let's have the maps where herbicide has been sprayed over the last 30 years. Those maps are available. We could come up with them and actually put them on and see, and actually look at the two areas I'd look at if you want to see if this is really an issue or not. Look at the Canaan River area, where in the 80s, people used to come in campers and camp there, and we harvested a ton of deer. And Charlotte County, where we used to harvest 4,000 deer. We've barely harvested 4,000 deer in the whole province in the last few years. So again, well, I guess the last few years that we've actually jumped up, but 2015, 2016. Look at those two areas, look at the intensity of glyphosate spraying, and see if there's not a correlation between the two of those, that there's a lot of spraying in those areas, which may also account for the lack of deer where there once was a ton of deer. If there's a lot of food available, the deer will go there, they will eat it, and the deer herd will grow. So if the other 75% is so good for deer, then why is there no deer on that land? I think the deer will tell us why. You know, the deer are in other areas now where there's a lot more food.
St. Andrews is my understanding.
There's lots of food there, lots of deer there.
Okay, we have another, hope that answers your question. And are there any other studies going on that you know of with either, that either of you know about on deer population or what's happening on those, in those areas of clear cuts or other parts of Crown land?
There's the UNB study that Rod was referring to. So Rod, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, that was started a couple of years ago. The main researcher is Phil Wiebe, but it started out with at UNB. The collars were purchased by JDI, and of course their staff were very involved in the study. I'm hoping Phil Wiebe is a sharp guy. I think a very trustworthy guy. I think we'll get some good information out of that study. And there's also some stuff done in Maine, but unfortunately, I think COVID's and other things, the chair of the Northeast Deer Group has left, and the website's about 2 years old now, and there's not a whole lot of activity there. So I'm not sure how far that's fallen apart, but Phil's going to be publishing some papers in the next year, so I'm waiting very anxiously to see those papers.
Okay. We have a question from Deborah Carr. Are there other health impacts on deers and other mammals other than the reduction of food sources?
That's a good question. And when I started speaking out about this, I was contacted by a researcher in Montana who had another thing that glyphosate does is it does something called chelating. But what it basically does is binds to trace minerals in the soil. And she had found that a lot of ungulates in Montana were being born with these short lower jaws. And I didn't put those slides in tonight, but when she asked me, have you seen that in New Brunswick? And I said, no, and I don't expect we will, because deer and moose leave the areas that are sprayed. So I don't expect deer in the wild will show any signs of that because they're not feeding on that. They leave it. They don't feed on it. But then again, I thought, well, actually they do feed on soybean and corn in areas that use GMO crops and spray glyphosate. And it wasn't 2 years after that, in 2015, I think was the first year I saw them. And all of a sudden we started showing, they call them dork deer, and they're born with a short lower jaw. And I do have pictures and skulls from those animals that have occurred across the province. And when I started showing interest in getting them and testing them, all of a sudden I couldn't get my hands on them any longer. But yeah, I know they do occur, and they show up in roadkill. And surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, they showed up, the ones that I know of, in around farm country in Keswick Ridge, and the other place that we've seen them is around St. John. So.
Okay, Hal, I'm going to get you to add to your question because I'm not sure what debate you're talking about. He says, why has the debate not happened? So I think I need to
know what he's talking about.
Do you know what he's talking about? Okay.
Oh, yeah, I do.
All right.
Well, I've said what I'd like to do, and I've said for years, we should have a public forum about this. Like, I'm not sure why there's only one side speaking about this issue, and as soon as someone else speaks about it, then you're labeled and whatever else happens to you. As scientists, if the data shows so clearly what you're saying, let's sit down and show it. Sit down, let's lay all the data out on the table and say, okay, what can we see from the data? What's it show? Let's have a debate about it. And actually, if you go on and Google CBC, Rod, Cumberland, and Lautenschlager, we had a little debate on Information Morning once. And, it was, practitioner against a PhD, and it didn't go very well for the PhD because, again, I'd spent a lot of time reading the papers and understanding what was going on. And he kept relying on studies that were done far away and on different animals. And, that's not New Brunswick. So, we talked about it, and saying that, the hardwoods bounce back and there's no such thing as a monoculture. And, that stuff's, all you have to do is go out in the province and walk through a plantation, you can see what it looks like. Marc André had some good slides of what a plantation looks like at 30 years of age. So yeah, why is because, why would you? Well, they don't have to have a public discussion because everything's going their way. So, until the public, say that they've had enough of it, things will likely keep on going the way they're going.
And I want to defend PhDs here.
Yes.
Dr. Villard.
I just wanted to point out that I didn't bother looking at glyphosate effects per se. I looked at the effects of plantations. I looked at the effects of selection and harvesting in the hardwoods, because to me, even without glyphosate, there was cause for worry with respect to forest management in New Brunswick. So glyphosate is the icing on the cake as far as I'm concerned, because our harvesting in New Brunswick has become way too intensive. And you just have to fly over the province to see that the footprint of harvesting is everywhere. And I think New Brunswickers who leave the main roads know very well what I'm talking about.
What do you think is the ideal mix?
Well, I showed the slide with the triad, and I think the ideal mix will vary depending on the species you're looking at and their requirement for space. But obviously 10% is not enough. And there are some studies starting finally to address this. And you can do some modeling exercises when you know well enough certain species, and you can model whether you need 10, 20, 30% protected areas. We used to have very few protected areas, but we had lots of so-called conservation forest. And the conservation forest was made up of buffer strips and old stands that were left aside until they became harvested, but they had to be replaced by another old stand elsewhere on the Crown land. And this is vanishing. So, and the proportion of plantations is increasing. So we're not going in the right direction. But nobody knows how much we need exactly, because those studies are just starting.
All right, and those are, so we'll go back to the questions from Frank Mullen. Is the budworm coming back, and how do we get the upper hand?
I can speak to that, maybe Rod after, but we've done some work on budworms in Quebec, because I left New Brunswick in 2016 from my own decision. But so we worked in the Gaspé Peninsula on budworms. And I know that the early intervention strategy, whereby you spray insecticides on every new epicenter of budworm, has worked so far. So even though there's been widespread damage in Quebec by budworm, New Brunswick is still pretty much free of them as far as I know. But how long is that going to work? I'm not sure. Nobody knows.
Yeah, and I could mention that it was mentioned in the budget just the other day by the BC government that they've set aside $3 million to combat the budworm. So they're doing a early intervention strategy where they're spraying these areas where they see a few budworm to make sure that they don't have the same outbreak that we had years ago. So I do know that. That's easy to find. Forestry Canada is very open and upfront about what they're doing with budworm. I'm sure if you Googled that, you'd come up with a lot of research that's being done at the federal level, Forestry Canada and Fredericton.
John Johnston sounds pretty frustrated. He says, where do we go from here? Is the stop spraying in New Brunswick on Facebook, is it doing any good? How do we get a united voice? How do we get our local provincial politicians interested? Either of you want to jump into that one?
Go ahead, Marc.
Ah, dear. Go ahead.
Is that deer, D-E-E-R or D-E?
I thought about it when I said it. Maybe I can jump in. At least when I was in New Brunswick, and I became really concerned, as I said, just about the overall intensity of forest harvesting in New Brunswick on the Crown lands, which I felt was, you know, my forest to some degree. I met with politicians. I met with a former DNR minister. It took me years to get a meeting, and we had a great meeting, but nothing happened. And I think that's the story. For anybody who is not part of the industry, nothing happens really when you speak to ministers, when you speak to the Prime Minister, the Premier. They don't listen to science. They're not really interested. So I'm not sure I'm cheering you up by saying this, but that's pretty much the truth, I think.
Did the public have did they influence the decision in Quebec?
Yeah, and, well, you know, the situation in Quebec is not that rosy. We have way more crown forest. We have 85% of the land area in public forest. Sure, you know, the herbicides were banned a long time ago, 20 years ago, but harvesting intensity is extremely high as well. There's been a big uproar because there was a movie about 20 years ago called L'Erreur Boréale, the Boreal Mistake. And that had a lot of impact. There was a commission. They released a report. There was a change in the way the forest management was overseen, but underground there was not much change. And there's been another news on TV recently that addressed the situation of crown lands in Quebec, and it's not very nice.
Rod, want to jump in?
Yeah, well, what I'll say, as far as what we can do, I mean, any issue in New Brunswick, I mean, we've had issues in the past, you know, the selling of NB power, fracking, you know, what solved those issues? You know, I mean, I don't think, you know, my concern is always the biology. I'm not going to tell people what they need to do politically, but I think if you look at different decisions that have been made or reversed in the province, it's very obvious what happened to change those decisions. I did send, as Marc-André, he made an effort with the politicians. In 2015, I sent, for a couple of weeks, I sent an email a day to the entire Legislative Assembly on science, on this published science on glyphosate that showed it was toxic to humans, it was toxic to wildlife, it was probable carcinogen. I sent all those to all the guys in the legislature for 2 weeks. So, and actually, I think it's right around 20 of those MLAs are still in the legislature today. And I sent all those papers to them then. And last fall, when there was a motion to ban the spraying of glyphosate by the Green Party, all the Liberals and all the Conservatives voted against it. So, you know, that's all I'll say. There's, you know, it's not that people don't understand or don't know. You know, although there is right now, I will say there's a standing committee on climate change and environmental stewardship. And it looks like there's going to be another opportunity for people to give presentations to that committee coming up, hopefully early summer. And, you know, that's where, you know, people have a chance to speak at least to that small political committee on the issue. So And if you don't want to go and speak publicly, you can do a submission. You can write it up and send it in. So I think there's opportunities right now to do something about it. So.
Okay. Another question from James Steidel this time. Lautenschlager says sprayed blocks are good for moose years 4 to 11, but have any of these studies talked about what happens after crown closure?
Yeah, and very good point. Whoever's asking that knows a little bit something about forestry, because the key in a plantation is remove the hardwoods so that the softwoods, that their crowns do touch, and you get crown closure, because the survival strategies, the silvics of the species is there's shade tolerant and shade intolerant trees, and shade intolerant trees are mostly hardwoods and they grow really quickly. They have to have the sun. And once that crown is closed, the crown closure is 100%. Doesn't matter what you have there, those hardwoods are not going to make it because they're shade intolerant. They're going to die. So that's a very good point. And again, I'd look at you need to look at this individual studies and see where they were done, what was growing there. I'm pretty sure that study that was done on moose was in the boreal forest, not in the Acadian forest. Anybody that hunts moose in the province knows what happens when you spray a cut. The moose leave it. We did see moose in plantations. I will say that when we were doing the aerial surveys, they were typically along the edges, because as anybody knows that's been in a plantation, that's where you'll get your willows and your birches and some poplar growing along the edges, and in any places that a tree's fallen down or you have a little bit of wind damage and stuff. So moose will go in and use those areas. They can cover a lot more ground, but yeah, it doesn't seem to have the same impact on moose as it does on deer. But for whatever reason, after 5 to 10 years, moose will return and use the edges and use the roadways, and because typically right close to that is another cut that has lots of browse in it. So
Okay. This is kind of out of, well, I'm sure it crossed people's minds. It says, can you speak to the new neurological disease found only in New Brunswick? I don't know if anybody can speak to that, even the people who are studying it at this point, but I don't know. Do either of you want to weigh in on that?
I heard about it yesterday.
Hmm.
So I won't venture a guess.
I heard about it a while ago. The cases are in Moncton and the Acadia Peninsula, which aren't places that you'd think there's a whole lot of glyphosate use. So, I mean, again, that's all, I'm one that I wouldn't venture anything unless you have some good science to back it up or some good data to back it up. So who knows? You're not going to get a whole lot of comment from me on that because we just don't know.
Okay. Frank Mullen does say, is it too early to associate glyphosate with the new sickness being discussed? Okay, I think we've answered that one. It is too early. I don't think anybody has the data on that yet, or what we haven't heard of. They've said they've been studying it since 2015, I think.
Mhm.
Cheryl McCumsey says, do you think that dealing with these issues at the federal level might be a better way of getting it addressed? So I'm guessing she means glyphosate spraying.
Well, I'll start, and Marc André can maybe answer as well. But the spraying of glyphosate, as far as how it's done in New Brunswick, it's paid for by the provincial government. It's done on Crown land in the forest, and 60% of the glyphosate use is in forestry. Agriculture, I think, is only 14% in the chief medical health officer's report on glyphosate use. However, it's registered by Health Canada, and back in 2015 when they were doing their review of glyphosate, and it was supposed to be a scientific review, and I was really keen on how that was going to turn out, and I got a 350-page copy of the Health Canada review of glyphosate, and again I was expecting it to be very scientific, and it was a farthest thing from that. It talked a lot about use and its importance. I could talk about that a long time. I have a whole 1-hour presentation I gave to the Department of Environment a few years ago on that to Roussel, and you just need to watch that. I go over all the, it's a lot to talk about, but essentially if Health Canada, if they would rely on the modern research and the same research that the IARC looked at to determine that it's a probable carcinogen, would probably see a whole different outcome on the Health Canada review. And the other disturbing thing with Health Canada in I think it's 2014 or 15, there was a review by the Auditor General of Canada that said that they were quite disappointed in Health Canada because they kept a product on the shelf for another 10 years after they knew it was problematic. So that doesn't give you a whole lot of confidence in the Health Canada position on this. And when the IARC came out and said it was a probable carcinogen, they just buttoned down their perspective and said, you know, you guys are wrong. And then the IARC, the International Association for the Research on Cancer, they came out even more firmly and said, listen, we use independent research. We don't use industry sponsored research. And we're using modern research, stuff done in the last 10 years. That's the other thing about the Health Canada research. Most of it's, you know, old research done by companies. They didn't use any of the modern research, which is really disappointing. 9% of the papers were in the last 10 years.
Okay.
I will just add quickly that I think all you need in New Brunswick to address, you know, all of these forestry issues, including glyphosate use and the concerns about it, is to elect a government with a backbone. And I was in New Brunswick for 22 years. I raised my kids in Moncton, and I could see the shift, you know, from governments who stood up to the industry, and gradually, you know, the government vanished. And when you went to Fredericton, you had the impression that you were talking to people who were posturing as politicians, but they were not making decisions. So there was a shift, and I can't tell exactly which government was responsible for this. I think it was a gradual shift towards, you know, leaving the industry run the Crown Forest, and the government is gone from the Crown Forest virtually. They're just, you know, pretending that they're managing it, but they don't have a say.
Strong words. John Michael Charles Crompton asks, how do we go about surveying bird populations as private citizens?
Well, actually, that's a great question, because now there's an application that you can download on your cell phone called eBird, and you can go anywhere in the province and anybody can actually record all the birds that they see or hear in that application. And these data are extremely useful to us to figure out, you know, what species are where, and including some rare species. Of course, when you find rare species, you have to document them. You have to describe what you saw, and ideally to provide a picture or a recording. But yeah, citizen science is a big part of ornithology right now.
Excellent. Hal Babcock wonders where he can see something that shows the areas sprayed with glyphosate. Does that exist?
Yeah, and I think you can get a map every year. The department, I think, puts the map on where they plan on spraying. But really what we need is the maps from the last 30 years that have all the blocks put on them. And I think it will be quite an eye opener. And DNR has that, and it should be public information. So I think you just need to make the request. I've made the request, but it hasn't quite come to my desk yet.
Okay. The anonymous attendee asks, are there alternative methods to managing plantations without the use of these herbicides, or I guess in particular glyphosate?
Well, Quebec has some plantations, and they do manual control. So they actually hire people instead of chemicals. It's tough work. But it can be done.
Right.
Yeah, and there's when I was last year in Charlotte County, there was a couple of young guys that actually were using spacing saws on private ground, and they were screaming for work. They said, the sooner they let us do that, the better. It'll do it. The other thing that I would say is, you hear all the time from the department that you can't do forestry in New Brunswick without glyphosate, and that's not true. Of course you can do it. It's done in Quebec, and it's a little bit more labor intensive, and it costs somebody a little bit more money. Whether that should be taxpayers or the the people that are profiting from the sale of the forest products that have seen a 5-fold increase in finished product prices in the last year, I'd say there's room there to maneuver. And I think our health is important enough, and the health of our forests and the health of our wildlife is important enough that we should make that decision. And I don't think enough people yet have been out of shape enough to actually make that point to the people that make decisions to say, no, you know what? Our health matters. The Acadia forest matters. It's our land, and we want it managed differently, and we can do that. And again, you can still have plantations. They can still be 95% stocked with evergreen trees. You just don't have the chemical doing it.
And glyphosate spraying is paid for by the taxpayers of New Brunswick, I understand. So Joel Terrio says the spray happens during the fall season. What happens to overlap with the first trimester of pregnancy for large mammals in Canada like moose? Glyphosate exposure during the first trimester is linked to miscarriages and reproductive problems. Could explain why the moose populations are dropping, he suggests.
Yeah, he's right on the money there. The time that glyphosate is sprayed is from late August to mid to late September. The peak breeding in moose is late September, early October. So it might miss it. And of course, the other thing that happens is moose leave the area. If it's sprayed, moose will leave it. So I'm not sure how much of an impact that has. I mean, I will say, looking at the deer reproductive data in the province, back in the 80s, deer were, we had 95% of the adult females pregnant. And the last few years, it's been around 70 to 80%. So there has been a drop in the successful breeding of deer in the province. And again, another question is why? And I can't tell you why. We never researched it. We were too busy managing. But that's an issue. And I pointed that out before I left, said, hey, there's something you need to look into. Our reproductive rates in deer keep declining. And again, unless you have a good cause effect study, it's, you can't draw that link. So.
Okay, it is 8:22, so we have only 8 minutes left. So we'll just go through these quite quickly. Phyllis Sutherland says, by footprint, you mean footprint of plantations? Not quite sure. Do either of you know?
I mentioned the footprint of intensive forest management. So what I mean is that you can see signs of management on virtually every hectare on 90% of the land base. And when you fly over New Brunswick, you see images like the one I showed where you see some kind of harvest treatment of some sort. And you're hard pressed to find closed canopy forests because there's all these partial cuts everywhere. Selection cuts, partial cuts, shelter wood, and then there's clear cuts and plantations. So there's virtually nothing left untouched, unless it's a protected area.
Okay, you may have already answered that. Then the next question is, Marc, please back up the statement that conservation forest process is vanishing. We have mapped conservation forests that are not cut. And as you mentioned, the government is in the process of increasing the conservation forest percentage to 10%, an additional 300,000 hectares.
Well, 10% is a far cry from the 17% that IUCN has recommended. And we're still around 4% as far as I know. As we speak, some areas are considered for protection, but they're still being cut because the industry has access to the information about areas that are considered for protection. So I think there's no reason to cheer. And there used to be quite extensive areas that were not former protected areas, but that were acting as protected areas. These were the old forests that were set aside as moving reserves, but those are vanishing.
If I could speak to that too, Catherine, because I think that's a good question. The conservation forest was made up of old growth, buffer strips, deer yards, things that mattered to the wildlife. And in 2014, with the forest strategy, that was dropped from 30% to 23%. And in the last few years, that's been mowed down. It's been cut. It's gone. And the conservative government did that. They made that decision. And now the conservative government is coming back and saying, oh, we're going to look at all the conservation forest we're going to put back. It's gone. It's been cut. So if they replace it with something, I'm not sure what they're going to replace it with or what it even looks like. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the footprint of the conservation area they're going to increase it to, guess what? And we hear all the time from government, it's a huge area. It's a huge area. Do you know what it equates to? Coincidentally, it's the same size area that we sprayed over the last 30 years that they say is so small. So I keep asking them, is 500,000 hectares, is it big or is it small? Make your mind up, because it's big if you're referring to the conservation forest, but it's small if you refer to spraying. And this increase in conservation forest is supposed to be the salvation of wildlife. Well, if adding 300,000 hectares is a salvation, spraying 500,000, I would submit could have an impact on white-tailed deer.
Okay. Deborah Carr, Marc André, is anyone studying the bird populations in New Brunswick?
As far as I know, there's people who took the space I used to occupy, but I haven't seen a lot of papers coming out since I left. So I can't tell you more than that, but there was someone who asked if she could pursue research on our study plots, and I welcomed her, but I haven't seen the papers coming out.
Okay. Have you seen any effects of glyphosate on partridge, wild turkey, and pheasant? Or what are the effects, from Leslie Chandler?
They're birds, but they're game birds. So Rod.
We'll throw that to the hunter. There's been no research in New Brunswick on it. I know that, and I'm not sure how much has been done in other areas. Obviously, turkey are a southern animal. I have no idea. I'm not a bird biologist, unfortunately, but no idea.
Okay. We are coming up to 2 minutes before 8:30. I think we're going to have to close it down there. If people want to hang in and have their questions answered, we can stay maybe another, I don't know, gentlemen, what are you available, another 10 minutes?
I'm good till tomorrow morning.
I am not.
I'm still standing.
Okay. Well, I just want to take this moment, I think, Rodrigo, if you could bring up a slide. I just want to remind people that these two gentlemen you've just heard from have been speaking very clearly and very bravely about what they've seen from their research. And if you can help, then you can go to friendsofrodcumberland@gmail.com. Rod is one of the people who is fighting a dismissal from his college, and any donation would be of great help. Sorry, Rod, I know you don't like me doing that, but I'm doing it anyway. Okay, so friendsofrodcumberland@gmail.com. And both of these gentlemen have felt the repercussions of speaking out and speaking the truth and sticking to their scientific fact and observations. All right, thank you for that, Rodrigo. And I now return you. And you know, I'm really, Mr. Babcock, I'm really not trying to get out of your question at the very bottom, which is directed at me. But we'll just, I'm glad I just wanted to take the time to do that. So thank you all for attending. And we'll just keep going till we work our way through the rest of the questions, I guess. Here we go. E.O. Wilson in Half Earth promotes 50% wilderness to help deal with climate change. What are your thoughts in 30 seconds or less?
Ooh. Well, that's the big issue that is not being addressed by New Brunswick is, you know, what are the other values of our forests beyond 2x4s and whatever else they build and sell at Kent Homes. You know, and climate change is a big one. And there are studies showing that as a forest ages, the trees grow slower, but they have such a large biomass that they actually fix more carbon than younger trees. At least it's been shown out west in the Pacific Northwest. And I think we should be thinking more broadly about how we want to use our crown lands. And right now there's only one value. Well, I'm being a little too harsh, but there's not much room for conservation. So 90% is geared toward harvesting and the industry's will. So I think fixing carbon is an important value that should be considered, perhaps even as important as harvesting.
The only thing I'll say to that is that did come up at the Climate Change Standing Committee in government, and Natural Resources was asked the question. They said that hardwoods sequester more carbon than softwoods. So I'd say that should factor into some people's decisions about what we're doing as far as forest management. I was quite surprised to hear the DNR staff say that softwood trees grow faster than hardwoods. What do you think of that, Marc André?
Depends on the species, eh?
It certainly does. And for the most part, hardwoods do outgrow softwoods. That's why we spray them. And the other thing is one of the species that's targeted a lot is poplar, and it's probably the best grown species, the fastest grown species, and will sequester far more carbon than softwoods. So I think that's a great question, whoever asked it, and I'd say keep beating that drum.
Okay. Now, from Barbara Higgins, does the glyphosate spray impact or cause the green poisonous sludge in the river during the summer? I think that's supposed to be from pesticide runoff, right? The crazy green, lime green that has been showing up in streams. Sorry?
Yeah, I know what she's talking
Yeah, the
about.
bacteria. What is it?
Blue-green algae.
Blue-green algae, right.
Yeah, and the glyphosate is sprayed in the forest. 60% of the use in the province is sprayed late August into the late September. So that would come into the whole agricultural issue. And there's a lot of things. It's actually fluorocarbons and the increase in, is it phosphorus? It's an increase in one of the chemicals in the water that causes that. I can't remember. But
phosphorus.
Yeah, phosphorus. That's it. Thank you. Needed somebody with a brain to help me with that. But yeah, I'm not sure.
You mean someone with a PhD.
Exactly.
James Steidel asks, are there bird density studies that compare conifer plantations to deciduous forests in New Brunswick?
Yeah, we didn't look at density. It's a funny story. I'll try to be quick, but we were involved in a study looking at how you can tweak pre-commercial thinning in plantations, or actually commercial thinning in plantations to increase their biodiversity value. But I was working with colleagues who worked on smaller things, smaller critters that didn't have the same need for space as birds. So we felt that we couldn't do research in the small plot sizes that they were planning to treat in the plantations. So that's how we got into comparing the older plantations to stands that had been allowed to grow naturally into a conifer-dominated forest. And I remember that some colleagues were very upset that we published before they did and showed negative effects of plantations, even though we were working in partnership with industry. So that's kind of an interesting twist, because not only the industry was upset at our publication, but also some colleagues who were supposed to be interested in open, free research. I'm not sure I answered the question. So yeah, we didn't look at densities per se. That was the question. We looked at number of species that we would find in a given sampling location in a plantation versus a naturally regenerated conifer forest. And we found fewer species, especially of cavity nesters in plantations, because there is less dead wood, of course.
I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this one right. Cheryl McCumsey is writing, glyphosate does some interesting things that suggest it might increase the risk of what prions do. One of the youngest people in the world to die of this lived in Edmonton, and she had no known exposure to wild meat. But PMRA registers this, and climate change is a national issue.
That's beyond my scope of expertise. I know that.
Mine
Yeah,
too.
I think we're going back to the question of the new disease discovered in the north.
Oh, I see. Thanks,
It's
Rodrigo.
related to to prions, but
Okay.
that's as far the
That's right.
research
You're
for
right.
now
Right.
knows. Yeah.
Sorry, we just don't have any answers to those, I'm afraid. So, okay, Hal, question for Catherine. Why do the main media outlets like your former employee, that would be CBC, for former employer, avoid tracking this problem and holding government and industry accountable? That's a big question. Off the top of my head, I can tell you just from the newsroom, working in the newsroom in New Brunswick, too few people, too little time. And what most good journalism comes down to, like good studies and good stewardship, often comes down to money. And journalism and the number of people who reporters there are has been reduced, as you may or may not know, and continues to be reduced on almost a daily basis. And good journalism is expensive. You have to have the time to let people look into that. When I was working in New Brunswick, it was rare to have more than a day to do anything. And the reduction in the newsroom of reporters also means that you no longer have a beat. So you don't have the depth of knowledge that you get just from covering something for 10 or 15 years, right? I did education for 7 years, and by the end of 7 years, I could ask, significant questions of the powers that be because I knew enough to do that, rather than reading a press release a day before and Googling a few things and trying to come up with an understanding of a subject like, white-tailed deer and birds in the forest. But you're right. I mean, more can be done and more should be done, but it takes people to come forward too and almost offer to the journalist guide.
If I may add something, in 2014, CBC did an outstanding coverage of the situation with the new forest management plan, and I'm sure that Rod can attest to that.
No question. They also had, Dr. Lautenschlager and I on Information Morning, which was great. And when I was let go, the lady that was interviewing me is hosting this event. So, I think that there's, they've made it. I think they've made a decent effort. The other surprising thing I will mention, though, when Lautenschlager and I were debating on CBC for the next 2 days, the sidebar advertisement was a J.D. Irving sidebar. I was really amazed by that. But anyhow, for what it's worth.
Random, don't you think?
Hey, who knows?
There was also Radio-Canada did a very good report.
Yes.
That involved Marc-André Villard too. Do you remember
And
the
Rod.
Yes, actually we're both
and
on
Rod,
that.
and some of the footage that I took.
That's
just saying.
the Enchanted Forest. So if you go to YouTube and Google, go to YouTube and type in the Disenchanted Forest. It's en français and in English both, and it covers a lot of this story.
Okay. Cheryl McCumsey again, and she has an expertise we do not share. Chlorpyrifos, which is being re-registered again without any health studies being reviewed. I think that might be the green cause. Anyway, I don't know. I'm just
Yeah, I
guessing.
think that's a federal issue, a Health Canada thing. I'm pretty
Okay.
sure is where she's going with that, but
She says folks who want more information on the impacts of mammals might want to connect with a Dr. Ted Dupmeier, Dupmeier. He's a vet in Saskatchewan.
yes, yes, he lost a lot of cattle to feed them a glyphosate laden feed.
There you go.
You're familiar with him, yeah?
Okay. Will this recording be made available? Will it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, well, I will share the Facebook recording that we are doing now, and also a YouTube recording.
Okay. And there'll probably be links on the Friends of Rod Cumberland page.
Exactly.
Okay. James Steidel, thanks for the presentation, gentlemen. Much appreciated. And hey, Hal said thanks to me. Thanks, Hal. Thanks for coming. So I think we'll wrap it up there. And thank you all very much for attending the webinar. And it was a very interesting discussion. And thank you especially to our two guests, Marc-André Villard and Rod Cumberland. And have a good rest of your evening. And just a note that there will be a third webinar. Watch out for it to be announced at the Friends of Rod Cumberland site. It's going to be on the Acadian forest and the impacts of glyphosate. Coming soon. Stay tuned. Thank you again, gentlemen, and thank you all for attending. And thank you, Rodrigo, for teching this. And to Margot Shepherd, who's also been sitting in. Thanks very much. And good night.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Good night.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Good night.